Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Deschutes Public Library presentation, Restoring a Keystone, Bringing Sea Otters Back to Oregon, presented by Chanel Hason of the Elakha Alliance. My name is Laurel, and I'm part of the events team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month, we offer a variety of free programs based on a theme, and February's theme is waves, and I was very happy to think of an excuse to learn about sea otters. If you have any questions during the talk, and I hope you do, please enter them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll ask them of Chanel at the end of the presentation. Chanel Hason is a marine biologist serving as the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. Thank you, Chanel, for talking to us about the efforts to restore sea otters to Oregon.
Hi, Laurel. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to the Deschutes Public Library for the invitation to present today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully you're nice and comfortable and in your PJs enjoying a fun talk about sea otters. So I'll just jump right into it. Yes, my name is Chanel Hason, and I've got wanted to just kind of introduce myself because probably you don't know who I am. So my background was in marine biology. I fell in love with the ocean when I was 5, went to SeaWorld, saw all the animals up close, and really wanted to work with them and be an ocean conservationist. So that led me to getting a degree in marine and coastal ecology from California State University, Monterey Bay, where I volunteered at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the world famous, amazing aquarium with sea otters and river otters, worked with them. I studied abroad in Australia for a year, conducting research on the Great Barrier Reef. And then a couple years down the line, ended up being an international scuba diving beauty queen for America, which it is a real thing, in Malaysia, and that was wild and a crazy adventure. And then I moved to Puerto Rico to be an eco tour guide naturalist for Jean-Michel Cousteau's Ambassadors of the Environment program for a year. And then that really led me down the path to get my master's degree in sustainability education at Portland State. So I moved there to Portland 10 years ago and just celebrating my 5th year as an employee for the Elakha Alliance, the first ever one for our nonprofit. So that is a little bit background on me. So today we're going to discuss a little bit about sea otter biology, about estuary and kelp forest ecology, and then end with the past, present, and future of sea otters here in Oregon. So sea otters, let's chat a little bit about them as a species. So they are part of the Mustelidae family, which is related to wolverines and badgers and minks and weasels. And there's 3 subspecies. We've got the northern sea otter, which are located in Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. We've got the southern sea otter, which is all off of the coast of California only. And then we've got the Asian or Russian sea otter, which ranges from Russia to northeast Japan. And out of the 14 otter species in the world, sea otters are the only fully aquatic ones. So they live their entire lives in the water, in the ocean. Every other otter species is semi-aquatic, so they live on land but frequent the water. Sea otters do everything in the water then. So they eat, they sleep, they give birth, they do everything while they're floating on their backs mostly. They live about 10 to 20 years. Usually females in the wild live a little longer. And they like to hang out floating together in rafts, is what it's called. And usually they're rafts of females and rafts of males. And they're not a migratory species. So that's a lot of people ask me, why don't they just come back to Oregon? Why don't they just swim back and migrate? But that's not how they expand their population. And they have really strong site fidelity. So wherever they were born, they're really drawn and tied to that one specific location. So, comparatively to other marine mammals, sea otters are the smallest marine mammal, but they're the largest otter species in terms of weight. But they lack what every other marine mammal has, which is a thick layer of fat, also known as blubber, and that helps keep them warm when they are swimming around in those cold ocean waters. But instead, sea otters have this really, really dense fur. And it actually consists of two layers. They have an underlayer and a guard layer. And so they're constantly grooming that really thick pelt of fur and putting a pocket of air in between those two layers of fur. And that's actually what's helping keeping them insulated in those ocean waters. And so they have up to 1 million hairs in 1 square inch, which is about the same size. If you do the OK symbol with your hand, that's about 1 square inch with the O. And just on our human heads, we have about 100,000 hairs if we're lucky. So that kind of puts it into perspective how thick this pelt is and why it's the world's densest fur. So sea otters have to constantly be eating. They have a really super duper high metabolism. So a 70-pound sea otter needs to eat about 20 pounds of food every day, which is about 3.6 tons per year. Their diet consists of crabs, clams, mussels, sea urchins, sometimes octopus and squid. Marine worms. They eat over 100 different species in the ocean. Most of them are all invertebrates, which are hard-shelled critters in the ocean. And they are highly intelligent predators. So they use tools, which I'm sure many of you have seen, to open up those hard-shelled invertebrates. So they kind of use it like an anvil, put a crab or clam on their chest and use that rock to crack it open and eat that tasty meat inside. Um, yeah, they have to constantly be eating. So, speaking of eating, they have to have really strong teeth, right, to eat all those hard-shelled invertebrates. And so their enamel is 2 times stronger than human teeth. And they've got these short, blunt skulls, and their teeth is actually fracture resistant. So that is super helpful while they're eating all those 100 plus different species. And they have the same bite force as a black bear, which is about 80 pounds. So never, ever, ever try and pet a sea otter in the wild, just regardless. Any wildlife, never try and touch. But now that you know that fact, hopefully that will draw you away from them even more. But they are the epitome of you are what you eat. And what do I mean by that? Is they can eat so many purple sea urchins that it actually turns their teeth, their skull, their vertebrae purple. And it's called echinochrome staining. So that's just from eating a ton of purple sea urchins, one of their favorite delicacies. It's kind of like when humans eat too many carrots, it turns our skin orange. It's kind of similar to that. So unfortunately, there are several threats to sea otters. We have predation by white sharks in some areas, and although white sharks don't eat sea otters look a heck of a lot like a seal or a sea lion that the white sharks are trying to eat to get that big fat blubber layer, and instead they get a mouthful of hair. And then they're like, nope, that's not what I wanted. And unfortunately, that's pretty fatal for the sea otters. Then we have some predation by orcas, killer whales, especially up in Alaska. There's a pod that's specifically really good hunters for sea otters. There was one female that washed ashore. She had about 6 sea otters in her stomach already, and then one was stuck in her throat, which is why she passed. And then we have some human-caused problems. Obviously, oil spills is one of the biggest one because if sea otters were to get oil on their precious pelt, which is how they keep warm, and they start to groom that pelt with the oil in it, then they ingest it, and that's just a bad situation overall for the otter's health. Um, and plastic pollution, ocean acidification are also some big concerns. And then I have a cat hanging on there because there is a bacteria in cat feces. So feral cats that are outside on streets um, and go and poop out there. And when it rains, that poop washes into the ocean and releases that bacteria into the water. And so it's called Toxoplasmosis gondii, and that's a highly dangerous bacteria for sea otters. It really creates a lot of neurological brain problems. So Oftentimes, I get a lot of emails from people in Oregon saying, I just saw a sea otter running along the beach in Depot Bay or in Bandon. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between river otters and sea otters so you can know what you find out in the wild. So we've got a lot of North American river otters in Oregon specifically. They are the only otter species in the world that is not listed as threatened or endangered. So their numbers, populations are plentiful. They're about 15 to 30 pounds. They're slightly smaller than sea otters. They swim on their stomachs mostly. And pretty much the biggest distinguished difference between river otters and sea otters is that tail. River otters' tail is almost double the size of their body, or half of the size of their body. And they've got four webbed paws, but they're super agile. So they can run on the beach, they can run over rocks, but they can be found on beaches and swimming in the ocean, especially near river mouths. So I can understand why some people might get confused that they're in the ocean, so they must be a sea otter. But river otters den on land, so they swim, they forage, they eat, but they come back to land to go to sleep at night. And they're usually in groups of 3 to 4. Sea otters, on the other hand, are about 50 to 100 pounds. They're very buoyant thanks to that really thick pelt. And you usually see them floating on their backs, as I mentioned before. And if you look at the photo of the one that's standing up, you can see their tail is about the same size as their back flippers. So they have really quite small tails compared to their body length. And also those big back flippers are another great distinguation, there we go, between river otters and sea otters, because those sea otters need to swim the majority of their whole lives. So they've got these big back flippers to swim in the water. And when they're on land, they're not very agile. So that's another big difference. If you see an otter running, most likely a river otter. So now we are all experts, right? So let's watch this video from the Oregon Zoo, which has both river otters and sea otters. Which one do you think these are? You can use the chat feature if you'd like. Or maybe that's turned off. I don't know. But the first ones were sea otters, and these ones we're seeing now are river otters. They really like their eggs. Thankfully, egg prices are back to normal. And then we've got the sea otters again, and they will show you in a couple seconds just how they use tools, like that rock, as part of their exhibit to crack open that oyster. And there's no wonder why sea otters and river otters are especially some of the top social media posts for zoos and aquariums. Okay, now let's chit-chat a little bit about sea otters and their role in healthy estuaries. And since we don't have sea otters in Oregon, let's jump to an estuary that has plenty of sea otters, and that's in California, the Elkhorn Slough, which is just outside of Monterey Bay. If you've never been there before, I highly suggest you put it on your bucket list. It is an incredible place with so much rich wildlife. So speaking of wildlife, there's over 350 different migratory bird species that come through. We've got marine mammals, great places for nurseries for their babies like harbor seals and obviously sea otters too. There's some really wonderful eco tours that you can go on, or you can even kayak around there and see some animals more up close. So one researcher in particular, Dr. Brent Hughes out of Sonoma State University, has been the front runner in discovering the interconnectedness of sea otters and estuary health. And for example, here is one of his research studies. So sea otters started to recolonize the Elkhorn Slough in about 1984. And he started to notice that the water quality started to get a little more clear. And he's like, huh, that's interesting. And the eelgrass started to be a little more healthy. So he discovered that since sea otters repopulated that area, they were eating a lot of crabs. And crabs eat these tiny little sea slugs, and those sea slugs eat algae that grows on the actual blades of the eelgrass. So if there's algae covering those blades of eelgrass, just like think if you just threw a bunch of dirt on top of some grass in your yard, then your grass would probably die immediately because it can't see the sun and photosynthesize and grow big and strong. So that would happen if crabs were overpopulating and eating all of those sea slugs, and then algae would then cover all of the eelgrass blades. But thanks to the sea otters, they are eating the crabs, which allows the sea slugs to do their job and eat that algae, which then means the eelgrass can photosynthesize and thrive, which is great for every animal in that entire ecosystem. And that creates a super balanced ecosystem. Let me get some water real quick. So, sea otters made their modeling debut in 2024 on the cover of Nature magazine with some new research from Dr. Brent Hughes again. So he realized that sea otters being in the estuary helped reduce coastal erosion. And that's because they were eating these marsh crabs that burrow down into the roots of the eelgrass, which dislodges the eelgrass and kills it. And so, with sea otters eating these marsh crabs, it allows those roots to not get disturbed and for the eelgrass to reproduce and get big and strong, and the system goes on. And so he discovered that having sea otters in the slough decreased erosion up to 90%, which is huge. And so that was a really big study and could be really important if sea otters were to be reintroduced into Oregon and an estuary. And so his latest research from Dr. Brent Hughes also found out that sea otters eating a different type of species of crab, the invasive European green crab, which we have also in Oregon, is a big problem. And so he discovered that one sea otter, southern sea otter, eats between 50,000 and 120,000 of these European green crabs, which is great to decrease an invasive species in an ecosystem, which throws off all of the native species. And even the European green crabs here in Oregon eat baby Dungeness crab. So they're competing for the same ecosystem, and it's a big negative. So that could also be a very positive thing for sea otters to help control in Oregon in the future. So, in general, when you have sea otters in estuaries, everybody's winning. You have a healthier ecosystem, there's more biodiversity, improved water quality, a safe haven for birds, for other marine mammals and different species. You have decreased erosion and really high biological productivity. So, now let's jump into a different marine ecosystem. This is a giant kelp forest. This one specifically is off of the coast of Monterey Bay in California. They comprise 25% of the world's coastline from California to Australia, South Africa, and Central America. They're one of the world's most diverse ecosystems. So these underwater forests, if you compare them to land, a lot of animals depend on that safety and for camouflage and hiding to have babies and shelter. So it's the same concept for both of those ecosystems. And although kelp looks like a plant, it's actually a brown macroalgae, which we'll talk about in a second. But I always like showing this video because if you haven't been scuba diving or snorkeling in a kelp forest, it really is this magical, unbelievable place, ecosystem, that you will always be surprised at what you see. And it's just gorgeous. It looks like something out of a dream. So in Oregon, we have predominantly bull kelp, which is photographed there on the left. We do have a small amount of giant kelp, which is on the right-hand side there. Um, but mostly we have bull kelp. If you see it washed up on the beach, I'm sure a lot of kids you've seen throw them around. Um, but as I mentioned, kelp is an algae. So, giant kelp in particular is the fastest growing algae on the planet. It grows about 2 feet a day and can reach 200 feet in length in total. On the other end, bull kelp can reach about 100 feet and grow about 10 inches a day. And so, since they are not plants, instead of having root systems, they have something called a holdfast. And so I kind of think of it like a hard, sticky spaghetti. Uh, so that attaches to a rock, and then ultimately they want the kelp wants to get to the surface of the water to get sunshine, to photosynthesize. And so it grows this really big stipe, and then it floats to the surface because it has a gas-filled bulb called a nematocyst. And then off of that bulb, there's 40 to 100 different blades that just want to reach the surface, get that sunlight, and photosynthesize. And for giant kelp, instead of having one bulb, they have multiple bulbs coming off of the stipe with one blade attached to each one, which in that video I just showed you was a giant kelp forest. So, why should you care about our kelp forests off of the coastline? As I mentioned, they are home to 1,000+ different species. So they provide shelter and food from everything from a tiny urchin or an abalone to a giant megafauna like a gray whale or a sea lion or harbor seal. It helps transport drifting eggs and larvae. It sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, helping mitigate climate change. The kelp forests themselves act as natural barriers, reducing wave energy and preventing shoreline erosion. Through photosynthesis, they produce oxygen, which supports life underwater and on land. And it supports fisheries. So juvenile Dungeness crab and rockfish live in this habitat. And it maintains a healthy marine environment by regulating species, populations, and nutrient cycles in the ecosystem. So, I kind of mentioned this before, but kelp helps fight climate change because it absorbs carbon. And so this plays a crucial role, especially supporting gray whales off of the coast of Oregon, which provide an essential habitat for krill and small fish and the mysid shrimp that they like to eat. And unfortunately, the Pacific Coast feeding group of these gray whales has decreased in size over 13% in the past 2 decades. And so scientists think that might be because we are losing a lot of our kelp forests at an alarming rate on the Oregon coast. And so these gray whales don't have as much to eat. But it could also be other factors as well. So as a visual learner, I really like this chart about how kelp and the carbon cycle works. So quickly, I'll go over this. So kelp uses sunlight and carbon dioxide from the water during photosynthesis to grow, and this process helps remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then as kelp grows, it stores carbon in its blades, stipe, and holdfast. And then when animals eat the kelp, the carbon stored in it moves up the food chain, supporting other marine life. And then when kelp dies, the hope is that it floats off and sinks down to the bottom of the sea floor to be covered by sediment for thousands and thousands of years, which ultimately traps that carbon for a really long time. And then the process continues. So personally, I really love these photographs and I like to show them because one, sea otters are very hard to spot underwater. Two, it's very hard to get photographs of them and also to be this close to them legally. So thankfully, my friend Ralph Pace is a great underwater photographer and gets hired by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, he has a permit to photograph them for different research purposes. And so we know that sea otters are a keystone species in these kelp forest ecosystems, thanks to Dr. Jim Estes and his groundbreaking research in Alaska. And so let's talk a little bit about what that means. So, a keystone species means that just a small number of animals in an ecosystem has a disproportionately large impact on the overall health and biodiversity of that ecosystem. So, specifically for sea otters, when sea otters are present, they're eating the purple urchins that are, turn their bones purple. And so when sea otters are removed from that ecosystem, then these purple urchins overpopulate. Urchins like to eat kelp itself, and so when you have an unchecked number of purple urchins, they basically destroy entire kelp forests, eating all of the kelp in their path. So this is currently happening off of our coastline in California too. So let's talk specifically about Oregon now. So in terms of urchins, we have two different types. We have purple urchins, which are about the size of your fist. And if you open your fist up, that's about the size of a red urchin. As I mentioned, they eat kelp, algae, decomposing critters that fall down to the sea floor. Something really unique about red urchins is that a scientist found one that was over 200 years old, which is wild. There could be older ones, we just haven't found them yet, but that's a fun thought. And that could be because sea urchins never stop growing. They just grow very, very slowly, about 1/100th of an inch per year after they reach adulthood. And they are really sensitive beings. And by what I mean by that is that they're sensitive to pollution. So they are great water quality indicators, but because if you see urchins not doing well in an ecosystem, it probably means that there's something wrong with the water quality, that there's pollution. So while sea otters have been absent in Oregon for over 100 years, we've had another predator in our kelp forest ecosystem, and that is the sunflower sea star. This is the largest sea star species in the world. They can be a couple feet in length across with over 24 arms, and everything gets out of their path when they're crawling along the seafloor, and that includes purple urchins. So they've been keeping the purple urchin population in check while sea otters have been absent. That is until about 2013, 2015, there was a huge marine heat wave that hit the coast. And unfortunately, something called sea star wasting disease hit every sea star species off of the West Coast. And about 95% of sunflower sea stars were completely taken out by this disease. So basically, their bodies would just kind of turn to mush and their arms would just break off from their bodies and crawl away from itself. So it's very sad. And unfortunately, they haven't bounced back from this disease as much as, say, okra sea stars, which we have a lot on the Oregon coast. Those are the purple and orange ones that you often see in the tide pools. And so now we have an ecosystem really out of balance. Um, and so the Oregon Kelp Alliance published this kelp forest status report a couple of years ago. And so they summarized about a decade of data of kelp forest cover. And they said about 2/3 of our kelp forest coverage is currently gone off of our Oregon coast. There are some places where it did gain coverage, but for the most part, historically, we are missing a big part of our kelp forest ecosystem. So it went from a really healthy kelp forest to what we now call urchin barrens, which is where sea urchins are overpopulating because nothing is eating them. And so they are just taking out stalks of kelp and just totally demolishing entire kelp forests, which are home to thousands of species. So it has a really big impact on the overall ecosystem. And so we need to do something about that. And another reason why these purple urchins are just the worst animal to lack a predator is because they just don't die. They turn into zombies. So basically, when they've eaten an entire kelp forest And they're like, okay, now what? They can just kind of shut their whole bodies down. They go into the starvation mode and they stop reproducing, they slow down their metabolism, and they just are kind of just zombie mode, waiting for something to die and fall down to the ocean floor for them to eat. And they can do this for over a year, which is insane. Which is why there's an estimated over 350 million urchins just in one reef alone in southern Oregon, for perspective. And that data was from estimate a couple like 5 years ago, so I can only imagine how much of an increase it is now. So next, let's chat about the past, present, and future of sea otters here in Oregon. So a very quick summary. Sea otters evolved about 2 million years ago, somewhere near modern day Russia. About 10,000 years ago, when Native Americans came to the Pacific Northwest, they lived alongside sea otters. And unfortunately, about 115 years ago, the maritime fur trade ended, and that decimated about 99% of the global population of sea otters for the hunting of their pelt. And about over 50 years ago, we did have a translocation attempt of sea otters off of the Oregon coast in the 1970s, which I'll dive into in a couple more slides. So I really want to touch upon the indigenous importance of sea otters along the Oregon coast. Our name, Elakha, as you can see in the first listing there, is a Chinook trade jargon word for sea otter. And then there's 6 different words for sea otter in 8 different indigenous languages just along the Oregon coast alone. And something really unique about Oregon is that bones found in shell middens, which were basically discard piles for indigenous peoples, showed that both northern and southern subspecies intermingled on the Oregon coast, which hasn't happened in over 100 years because the southern subspecies in California has not just gradually expanded naturally north anymore because of a white shark population in Northern California. So their genetic diversity is really, really low in comparison to the northern subspecies. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But just want to mention that to reintroduce sea otters back to Oregon could interbreed. Well, they're the same species, but there's nothing really different genetically between the subspecies, just geographic. So to have northern and southern intermingle again would be really crucial for the overall genetic diversity of the species. Um, so the maritime fur trade happened in the 1780s to the early 1900s. And basically, the Chinese really valued sea otter pelts. And so this launched Russian, Spanish, American mariners to come to the Pacific Northwest to hunt sea otters. And in just a couple hundred years, as I mentioned, they killed an estimated around 500,000 sea otters. And the last sea otter pelt was traded in Oregon in 1910 based on an article in the Coos Bay Times. So that's the last evidence we have of a sea otter here on the Oregon coast. So thankfully, 1% did survive. Woohoo! So we have a tiny population off of the coast of California, off of the coast of Big Sur, about 50 survived the fur trade. So every sea otter in California stems from that surviving 50 of the fur trade. And there's about 3,000 there now. So they're all kind of related. And then there were some small pockets across Alaska and near Russia too. So how many sea otters are there today and where do they live? Let's jump into that. So California, as I just mentioned, has about 3,000 sea otters and they are at capacity right now. And that's just because they can't expand naturally, as I mentioned, because of white shark predation. But there is an effort to reintroduce them in Northern California, along with Oregon too. And then in Washington, we have also about 3,000, and they were reintroduced there in the 1970s, and so they are doing quite well. British Columbia has about 8,000. They were also reintroduced there in the translocation attempt in the 70s. Alaska has about 100,000, which is where 90% of the global population of sea otters live. So if you ever want to see a sea otter in the wild, go to Alaska. I have heard some amazing stories of people doing some eco tours there. Japan has a very small amount, about 50, and Russia has about 18,000. So we did have a translocation effort in 1970. So why did this happen? What sparked this? So there were nuclear bomb testing by the US government that was going to take place at Amchitka Island in Alaska. And so researchers were like, well, we gotta save these animals. They're just gonna all die if you do this nuclear bomb testing. So thankfully, they got funding pretty quickly to capture as many sea otters as they could and translocate them to Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska. So nearly 100 were released in Cape Arago, um, and a little, let's see, um, about 50 or so in Port Orford. And I want to mention none of these sea otters were tagged, and they were held in floating pens, um, and they weren't tracked for the first year, so nobody was monitoring where they went. So some animals appear to have tried to swim back home once they were released. As I mentioned, they have a really strong homing mechanism. But some did stick around for about a decade and have pups, but eventually their numbers dwindled, and then there were none. And so researchers think they just didn't release enough animals initially to withstand natural immigration and mortality rates that happen in a wildlife translocation. So that is what we're working on, is planning this out for future reintroduction. There's a lot better translocation tools. We know a lot more about the species. And we have lots of planning and lots of great minds from across the globe who want to make this as successful as possible. So let's talk a little bit about who we are, the Elakha Alliance. So it became an official 50C3, 501c3 in 2020, but the idea behind Elakha Alliance started in 1999 with the late David Hatch, who is seen there on the left. He is from the Siletz tribe, and he was building a boat with his son Peter and came across the word Elakha in a Chinook trade jargon dictionary as a name for his boat. And he's like, huh, what happened to Oregon sea otters? Why don't we have them anymore? And so then that led to several decades of meeting people, researchers, scientists, other tribal members to figure out how we can bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast to restore that cultural significance, to help our kelp forest ecosystems, and to help enhance our local coastal communities. Unfortunately, he passed away unexpectedly in 2016. But that's when our board president, Bob Bailey, gathered a bunch of amazing people together to form our board of directors. And then we became an official nonprofit in 2020. And so I like to say we're a small but mighty team making big waves in ocean conservation. We are now a full-time staff of 4 people, myself, and then we've got Jane Beccari, our executive director. We're both in Portland area. And then we've got Katie Russell, our development and operations coordinator in Eugene, and then Kyle Motley, our coastal community coordinator in Coos Bay. And we are currently in the hiring process for a reintroduction planning manager. So our mission, if you haven't figured it out already, is to make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters back to the Oregon coast. And I want to mention we did update this at the start of last year to really focus that the point of this is to really help restore our marine and coastal ecosystems and restore the connection with our communities. That's really the big end goal. Sea otters are cute and adorable, and ecosystem engineers and keystone species, but the end goal that we all want in the ocean conservation world is to have a better, healthier ecosystem because it benefits all of us. And sea otters are the best long-term solution for that. So we are very rooted in getting the science right. In 2020, uh, we hired the top 6 sea otter scientists to figure out, is it even feasible to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast? Because we wouldn't do that if it's not feasible, right? So thankfully, in 2022, the feasibility study was published, and some of the key takeaways was that yes, past reintroductions of sea otters has been very successful for the overall health of the population, and reintroducing them in Oregon is very likely to succeed. Estuaries may be a really key place to reintroduce them because our eelgrass beds are also struggling in Oregon. There's positive and negative effects, and so we are working to fill those research gaps with information there. And thankfully, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also published a feasibility assessment of reintroduction in Northern California and Oregon in 2022 as well. And they did say that reintroducing sea otters to Oregon is ecologically feasible and could have significant benefits for marine ecosystem health, which is huge. But U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has not taken a position at this time whether to move forward. And I don't think we will hear from them for the next 4 years. So, what are our next steps? And what I'm doing right now, outreach and public engagement. There's still so many people I interact with for the past 5 years that don't know we don't have sea otters on the Oregon coast and that we used to, and that there's really strong cultural significance. So I think thank you for listening to me today. It's really important for this message to be known. We are also ramping up our political engagement and support, which I'll talk about a particular action alert that you can do. I do have a QR code that goes to our election alert page where we have 2 of them. So if you want to scan that, I can also put it in the chat for you. And then we're also increasing our tribal engagement. I'll talk about a really exciting grant that the Siletz tribe received in a second. And then, as I mentioned, we're filling in information and research gaps based on our feasibility study. So, for example, we hired the Big Fish Lab out of Oregon State University to figure out where white sharks frequent on the Oregon coast because nobody did that study yet. So, we don't want to release a whole raft of sea otters into a secret white shark hangout spot. And so we were working really closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the past several years, but they have taken a step back with this administration. So now we are really focusing on more of a tribal state-led effort to make a reintroduction happen. And so we worked with the Siletz tribe to apply for an America the Beautiful Challenge grant in 2024. And thankfully, they received it. And so they were awarded $1.56 million to lead a planning process for sea otter reintroduction in Oregon and Northern California over a 3-year time period. So that just started this year, which is why we have funding now to hire a reintroduction planning manager for the next 3 years. So that person will help facilitate all of the parties involved, which is several tribes in Oregon and in Northern California and other partners as well, to write this reintroduction proposal. So this is huge and really fantastic news to help fuel our work for the next several years. I also want to mention a recent partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Network. So we last year in 2024, or wait, what year are we in? 2025. Last year, 2025, they launched the Sea Otter Fund. So WCN is a group that connects really wealthy donors with really important wildlife conservation work around the globe. And so the launch of this specific sea otter fund, they're trying to raise $42 million in the next 12 years for sea otter restoration along their historical native range in the U.S. Pacific Coast range. And so this is huge because this would be private funding for sea otter restoration in Northern California and Oregon. And so to have this private funding to potentially earmark and give to ODFW to lead a reintroduction effort could be how it happens. So how can you help our effort? I'm glad you asked. So you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is called The Raft. It comes from me once a month. So that just keeps track of our research and efforts. It gives you all our events for the next upcoming month and any big news articles you should know regarding the coast. You can also donate. We are a nonprofit and we don't have a single funder. So individual donations are super helpful. And then I've got a bonus coloring page if you have some kiddos in your life that really love sea otters. This is all available on our website too. So one action alert that is very pertinent right now. I will be at the the state capitol in Salem tomorrow for a whole 1.25% for Wildlife Action Day. And so if you scan that QR code with your phone, it will take you to an action alert to send to your state representatives and senators, letting them know that you want wildlife conservation to be on the front of their mind and to support House Bill 4134, which would raise the state lodging tax 1.25%, and it would be at 2.75%, which is the third lowest in the United States for state lodging tax. So basically, any tourists who come and stay at hotels in Oregon will just have maybe an extra $2 on their bill, and that could fund $25 million a year in wildlife conservation in Oregon, which currently has zero funding because all of the federal budget was cut for ODFW. So I can talk more about that later, but that is really helpful because it is being discussed right now. And so if you are on social media, wonderful. So are we. Please follow us if you would like. And you can also get to our website where we have a plethora of information about kelp forests, science, sea otters, cultural significance, all the things. And you can get there easily by just typing OregonSeaOtters.org. I want to mention we are an alliance, which means we can't do this by ourselves. And thankfully, we have some incredible partners from nonprofits to government agencies to foundations and everything in between. So I really want to give them a shout out for their assistance on sea otter restoration. And I want to mention that sometimes we do have lone male sea otters that come down from the Washington population and can be seen on the Oregon coast maybe 5 times a year. And so this happened in 2024, in June of 2024, where we had two males from the Washington population show up in Ecola State Park in Cannon Beach. And so thankfully, I was able to go down there myself and witness them with my own eyes, which was pretty magical to see what the future of Oregon could look like. This was the first time that two live ones were seen on the Oregon coast that I've ever heard of so far. So it was pretty amazing and also really hopeful that hopefully sea otters are back again. But they're just looking for girlfriends. And that's a great example of him just looking around where the lady's at. Sorry, we don't have any female sea otters off of the Oregon coast right now, but hopefully in maybe 5 to 7 years, we'll have a reintroduction and he can find some girlfriends. So that is what I have for you today. And please ask whatever questions you have.
I'm still shocked by the number of hairs in a square inch on a sea otter. That's crazy.
Yeah,
Uh,
very cool.
one question. Have there been efforts to increase genetic diversity in the pockets of sea otter populations? Have we seen issues with inbreeding in those populations like that? uh, small population of Big Sur.
Yeah. So the northern subspecies population and the Russian Asian species have plenty of sea otters. Um, so there is no question about genetic diversity there, but the ones off of California's coastline have they can't expand anymore. And so their genetic diversity, as I mentioned, is really low. I don't think there's any research about inbreeding per se because there's about 3,000 of them. But in comparison to the over 100,000 plus northern subspecies compared to 3,000, you can tell that that is pretty genetically low. Great question, though. Thank you for that.
Yeah, please enter your questions in the chat. I will admit, I always imagine kelp forest as a little creepy. Uh, but you talked about them as magical. Did that surprise you the first time you went into a kelp forest yourself, how what you saw or what you
Yeah. Yeah, I got my advanced and rescue certification while I was in college at Cal State Monterey Bay. And so we were very lucky just to drive up the street and jump into a kelp forest for our training. Um, and it's whenever somebody asks me, what's your favorite place that you've been diving? What kind of ecosystem? And kelp forests are there at the top because they're just this magical place. As I mentioned, I have a friend who describes it as like you're in a cathedral with the like sunbeams coming through the blades of the kelp, and it's just amazing. And you just look around and there's life everywhere. And I don't know, it's hard to describe. So I always like showing that video because if you don't just sit at the bottom of the seafloor and look up and see this beautiful forest of algae floating above you, and then you see a harbor seal dive down and check you out. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful ecosystem. And we rely on it for oxygen. Part of the oxygen we breathe comes from algae in the ocean. So when people are like, oh, why should I care about kelp forest? It's not like I go in there every day, but it's like, do you breathe every day? Then you should care where your oxygen comes from.
well, and you mentioned that the urchins are a sign of good quality of water. Does that mean
Mhm.
that we have good quality of water in Oregon?
Yeah. So we have cold upwellings of nutrient-rich water, which kelp forests aren't always the clearest place to go diving, which is okay because that means the water is really nutrient-rich compared to the eelgrass beds, which make estuaries cleaner water. Um, but yeah, our I haven't heard of any problems with the water quality off of the Oregon coast.
Oh, someone's asking, are there things that we can do when we walk the beach and tide pools to help the ecosystem recover?
Great question. Yes. So, what you can do is pick up any trash that you find. Unfortunately, every time I walk along the beach, there is some sort of marine debris there. So, bring an extra bag in your car to take out anything that shouldn't be near an ocean ecosystem. And also to observe but not touch tide pool animals is also really helpful for the overall health of the ecosystem because your skin oils could really impact the health of that invertebrate. So mostly that, and also to make sure other people are not doing those things and to report that if somebody, I think recently I saw a post, somebody had like a whole bag of sea stars and they're trying to just walk away from the tide pool with it, and all these, wonderful citizen activism scientists were like, no, you can't do that, and reported them to the authorities. So yeah, just be on the lookout and take care of our precious ecosystems.
Well,
And
I
also
am.
support coastal nonprofits too. There's a lot of other amazing coastal nonprofits doing great work that lead, uh, tours of tide pools, like in Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, Haystack Rock Awareness Program, all these amazing groups. So be sure to look for fun activities like that next time you visit the coast.
Mm. Well, I know I and probably everyone else here looks forward to seeing potentially sea otters in the next few years on our coast. So thank you for talking to us today, and thanks for your efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here, and hopefully next time I can be there in person. I'm trying
Yeah,
to do some tabling in Bend area, so I'll let you know when I do.
okay, please do. Okay,
Mhm.
thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.